Nick Vance stood before the empty casket, his dress uniform feeling too tight around his neck. The holographic image of his brother Michael floated above, showing him in his combat gear, smiling that cocky smile that had always driven Nick crazy growing up. But now, he'd give anything to see it again in person. 3 weeks ago, he'd watched the classified combat footage for the 13th time. Unlucky 13. Michael's unit charging the Fress stronghold, their conventional weapons barely scratching the alien defenses. The energy barrier flashing brilliant purple before. Nick closed his eyes, but the image played on in his mind dozens of human soldiers, his brother among them, simply ceasing to exist as the Fress defense grid activated. He died fighting, someone said behind him. Nick turned to find General Roberts, his brother's commanding officer, standing there. The old soldier's face was etched with lines of fatigue and guilt. "But you already know that, Lieutenant Vance." "Yes, sir," Nick replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen the footage." The general's eyes narrowed slightly. That footage was classified. "I have good friends in intelligence," Sir Nick met the general's gaze. "I needed to know." Instead of anger, a ghost of a smile crossed Robert's face. "Your brother said you were persistent." He glanced around the nearly empty chapel, then lowered his voice. "How would you like to make his sacrifice mean something?" Nick's attention sharpened. "Sir, we're developing new tactics, new weapons. The Fress think they've got us figured out, think their technology makes them invincible." The general's eyes gleamed. "We're going to prove them wrong. Ever studied ancient warfare, Lieutenant?" The question seemed out of place, but Nick answered anyway. "Some, sir. Required courses at the academy." "Good. What do you know about spears?" Nick blinked, confused. "Spears, sir." Roberts handed him a small holodisk. "Report to Major Hassan at 0800 tomorrow. That's assuming you're interested in being part of something revolutionary." Before Nick could respond, the general was walking away, leaving him standing there holding the disk, his brother's holographic smile still shining above the empty casket. Later that night, in his quarters, Nick activated the disk. The holographic display showed something that made his breath catch: a human warrior in some kind of advanced armor, wielding what looked like a sword, cutting through Fress soldiers like they were made of paper. The footage shifted to show various weapons being tested against Fress armor samples. Traditional energy weapons bounced off harmlessly, but these new melee weapons, swords, axes, and, yes, spears sliced through the alien material with ease. The final image was a recruitment notice for something called the Melee Marine Program. At the bottom was a personal note from General Roberts: "Your brother died trying to break their defenses the old way. Help us do it the even older way." Nick's hand drifted to his chest, where Michael's dog tags rested under his shirt. His brother had always been the one rushing in first, taking the biggest risks. Nick had been the cautious one, the planner, the one who thought things through. But watching Michael die had changed something in him. The Fress had taken his brother, vaporized him so completely there wasn't even a body to bury. And now, here was a chance to hit back, to do something the arrogant aliens would never expect. The next morning, Nick arrived at Major Hassan's office 10 minutes early. The gruff officer took one look at him and nodded. "Robert said you'd show up," Hassan said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Most of our recruits are being trained on swords, but we've got a special group testing other weapons. Your psych profile and combat scores suggest you'd be perfect for the Spear Corps." "Spear Corps," Nick repeated, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Problem with that, Lieutenant." Nick thought about the footage he'd seen, both of his brother's death and of that armored warrior cutting through Fress defenses. He thought about Michael's cocky smile, about the empty casket. "No, sir," he said firmly. "No problem at all." Good. Hassan handed him a tablet. "Report to Captain Jack Wallace at Training Facility 7. And Lieutenant," he fixed Nick with a steely gaze, "I know about your brother. This isn't about revenge. It's about winning a war. Are we clear?" Nick met his eyes. "Crystal clear, sir." But as he walked out of the office, Michael's dog tags feeling heavier than usual against his chest, Nick knew Hassan was wrong. This was about both. Training Facility 7 turned out to be a massive underground complex carved into the heart of the Rocky Mountains. As Nick stepped out of the transport, he couldn't help but marvel at the enormous hangar doors built into the mountainside, each emblazoned with a distinctive emblem, a sword crossed with a spear. Admiring the view, Lieutenant. Nick turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face marked by a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. His uniform bore the rank of captain, and despite his imposing presence, there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. Captain Wallace. Nick snapped to attention. At ease before you sprain something. Wallace gestured for Nick to follow him. Welcome to what we affectionately call the Vault. This is where we're reinventing warfare. As they walked through the facility, Nick saw dozens of soldiers in training. Most wielded swords that hummed with barely contained energy, but he also spotted a few with axes, and in one corner, a woman practicing with what looked like a war hammer. Sir, Nick ventured, about the Spear Corps. You're wondering if you drew the short straw. Wallace led them into an equipment room that made Nick's jaw drop. Along one wall hung various melee weapons, each gleaming with the distinctive sheen of advanced metallurgy. The swords get all the glory, sure. They were our first breakthrough. But in warfare, Lieutenant, reach is life. Wallace approached a weapon rack and lifted a spear that seemed to ripple with an inner light. Its shaft was black as space itself, marked with pulsing blue lines that ran its length like electronic veins. The spearhead, double-edged and elegant, looked like it could pierce the heart of a star. This, Wallace said with evident pride, is the AP-7 combat spear. Power field generator in the shaft, monomolecular edge on the blade, and enough reach to skewer a Fress before they even get close to you. The sword core has to get in tight. You'll have options. Nick took the weapon when Wallace offered it. It felt right in his hands, perfectly balanced despite its length. How does it penetrate their energy barriers? Same principle as all our new weapons. The power field creates a localized disruption. But the spear's got another advantage. Wallace pressed a button on a nearby console, and a holographic Fress soldier appeared. The barriers are optimized to stop energy weapons and explosives. A physical object moving at the right velocity, carrying its own disruptive field. Might as well be tissue paper. The next few hours were a blur of introductions and orientations. Nick met his squad Mary Bell Applegate, a former fencing champion who'd chosen the spear over the sword. Marcus Smith, built like a tank and surprisingly agile with his weapon, and James Lucky. O'Connor, who'd survived 3 different Fress attacks before volunteering for the program. But it was during their first live training session that Nick truly understood what he'd signed up for. Power fields on Wallace barked from the observation platform. Show me what you've got. Nick activated his spear, feeling the weapon come alive in his hands. The shaft thrummed with energy, and the blade began to glow with a fierce blue light. Around him, his squad mates' weapons lit up in similar fashion. The training drones emerged, roughly Fress-sized, equipped with their own energy barriers. Nick's first thrust was tentative, unsure. Stop thinking. Vance Wallace's voice boomed. Your brother's unit died because our old weapons couldn't breach their defenses. Show me why you're here. Something snapped inside Nick. His next attack was fluid, precise. The spear's tip pierced the drone's barrier like it wasn't there, the blade sinking deep into its core. The power field did its work, shredding the internal components. Better, Wallace called out. But one lucky strike doesn't win a war. Again. Hours passed in a grueling cycle of attack, defend, adapt. Nick's arms burned, his lungs were on fire, but with each passing minute, the spear felt more like an extension of his body. He learned to use its reach to keep enemies at bay, to strike from angles that would be impossible with a sword, to use the shaft for defense when needed. It was during a water break that Lucky sidled up to him. Heard about your brother, he said quietly. Saw the footage too. That Fress commander, the one they call Colognes? Real piece of work. Nick's grip tightened on his water bottle. You were there. Support unit. Saw the whole thing. Lucky's eyes were haunted. But we're different now. We've got a chance. He nodded toward their weapons. They think they know everything about human warfare. Wait till they meet the point of your spear. As they prepared for another training round, Wallace approached Nick. "You're holding back," the captain said bluntly. "I can see it in your form. You're fighting like you're still using old weapons, trying to stay safe. The Spear Corps isn't about playing it safe." "With respect, sir, isn't that exactly what the Spear is for? Keeping distance." Wallace's scarred face broke into a grim smile. "The reach is an advantage, yes, but never forget what you're really holding." He tapped the spear's shaft. "This is humanity's answer to Fress arrogance. Every thrust, every strike carries the weight of everyone we've lost, including your brother." Nick started to protest that this wasn't about revenge, remembering Hassan's words, but Wallace cut him off. "It's not about revenge, Lieutenant. It's about justice. It's about showing them that all their technological superiority means nothing against human adaptability and determination." He stepped back. "Now, let's see what you can really do with that spear." The training drones emerged again, more numerous this time. But now, as Nick settled into his stance, he felt different. The spear hummed in his hands, eager for action. He thought of Michael, of that cocky smile, of an empty casket. Later that evening, as Nick sat cleaning his spear in the maintenance bay, he overheard two logistics officers talking in low voices by the supply lockers. "You hear about the facility they've got running in Texas?" one whispered. "That classified site outside of Austin? Thought that was just a rumor." The first officer shook his head. "My cousin's stationed at command. Says they've got their own program running down there. Different approach, same concept. They're calling themselves the Texan Knights." "Knights? Seriously?" "Dead serious. Word is they're focused on heavy armor configurations. Real medieval stuff, but with our new tech. Apparently they've got some experimental shield generators too." The conversation drifted off as the officers moved away, but Nick found himself smiling. The Fress thought they had humanity figured out, thought they knew all their tricks. But all across Earth, humans were adapting, evolving, finding new ways to fight. Or rather, finding very old ways to fight with very new tools. Now, from the mountains to the plains, humanity was arming itself with the weapons of its ancestors, ready to write a new chapter in the art of war. The descent through Novus 11's atmosphere was rough enough to make Nick's teeth chatter. Through the transport's viewport, he could see why this world had earned the nickname Twilight's Edge among the troops. The planet's binary stars were perpetually low on the horizon, casting everything in an eternal dusk broken only by the occasional flash of aurora in the upper atmosphere. "Beautiful," in a deadly sort of way, Mary Belle Applegate commented from the seat next to him, her spear secured in the rack above, like a frozen hell. Hell's supposed to be hot, Lucky called from across the aisle, but his usual humor seemed forced. Everyone knew what waited for them on the surface. The Fress had turned Novus 11 into a fortress world. Initial reconnaissance had revealed massive fortifications carved into the planet's mountain ranges, connected by underground networks that spread like a web across the frozen surface. The perfect defense network for a species that didn't mind confined spaces. Captain Wallace moved through the transport, checking gear and offering last-minute advice. He stopped at Nick's position. "Remember your training, Lieutenant. The Fress have adapted their defenses based on reports from other fronts. They're expecting swords. The spear's reach might be our ace in the hole." Nick nodded, trying to ignore the way his stomach lurched as the transport hit another pocket of turbulence. 3 months of intensive training had transformed him and his squad into something new, not quite the knights of old, but not traditional Marines either. They were something in between, something the Fress hadn't planned for. The transport's internal lights shifted to red. 2 minutes to landing, the pilot announced. "Better clench up, melee Marines." Nick activated his armor systems, feeling the familiar embrace as it powered up. The latest generation of combat suits was a marvel of engineering, designed specifically for close-quarter combat against Fress weapons. The helmet sealed with a soft hiss, and his HUD came alive with tactical data. "Check your power fields," Wallace ordered. "I don't want any surprises when we hit the ground." Nick grasped his spear, feeling the weapon surge to life. The familiar blue glow of the power field illuminated the transport's interior, mixing with the red warning lights to cast purple shadows. Around him, Other weapons activated, mostly swords, with his small spear squad being the exception. The transport touched down with a bone-jarring thud. For a moment, everything was still. Then the bay doors opened, and Novus 11's bitter cold rushed in like a living thing. Move, move, move. They poured out of the transport in practiced formation, Nick's squad taking up positions on the right flank. Other transports were landing nearby, disgorging more melee Marines onto the frozen surface. Through the swirling snow, Nick could see their objective, a massive Fress fortification built into the side of a mountain, its energy barriers creating a shimmering curtain of light in the twilight. First reading coming in, Marcus reported, his helmet's sensors scanning the defenses. They've modified their barrier frequencies, different from what we trained against. They learned fast, Wallace acknowledged over the comm. But so do we. Spear Squad, you're our pathfinders. Find me a weak point in those barriers. Nick took point, leading his 4-person team forward through the snow. Their armor's thermal systems were working overtime against the cold, but even so, the chill seemed to seep into his bones. The spear's power fields left bright trails in the dim light as they advanced. The first sign of Fress resistance came without warning. Energy bolts sizzled through the air, forcing the squad into defensive positions behind ice-covered rock formations. Multiple hostiles. 2 o'clock, Mary Bell called out. They're using some kind of new weapon configuration. Nick peered around his cover, his HUD highlighting the Fress positions. The alien soldiers were using modified energy rifles, firing in patterns designed to overwhelm their armor's defensive capabilities. But more interesting was what he saw behind them. Captain, he called over the comm, you seeing this? They've got some kind of physical barriers set up. Look like they're designed specifically to stop melee charges. Guess they did their homework, Wallace replied grimly. Good thing we brought the right tools to deal with homework. Nick understood immediately. The barriers might stop a sword-wielding Marine in their tracks, but a spear? That was a different story entirely. Squad, form up on me, he ordered. Power fields to maximum. We're going to show them why ancient humans favored the spear for breaking shield walls. As his team moved into position, Nick thought of Michael. His brother had died charging these same kinds of defenses with conventional weapons. Now, standing on this frozen world with a weapon that bridged humanity's past and future, Nick felt something crystallize inside him. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about proving that humanity's greatest strength wasn't its technology, but its ability to adapt and overcome. For Earth, he said quietly, then louder, Spear Squad, advance. They moved forward in perfect synchronization, their powered spears held ready. The Fress positions erupted with energy fire, but they were ready for it. And as they closed the distance, Nick saw something he never thought he'd see: uncertainty in the Fress troops' movements. They had prepared for swords, had fortified against close combat warriors, but the sight of humans advancing with spears seemed to give them pause. That pause was all they needed. And now, on a frozen world at the edge of known space, they were about to learn why the spear had been humanity's first choice for warfare since the dawn of civilization. The first Fress barrier fell to Nick's spear like tissue paper. The power field disrupted the alien energy shield, and the physical blade did what it had been doing since humanity's earliest days. It pierced deep into the enemy's defenses. Breach point established, Nick called out over the comm. Squad, push through. Sword teams, follow our lead. His squad moved with practiced precision, their powered spears creating a lethal zone of control that forced the Fress troops to keep their distance. Behind them, sword-wielding Marines poured through the gap they'd created, their own weapons humming with barely contained energy. The Fress response was immediate and fierce. Energy bolts filled the air, their modified weapons proving more effective than intelligence had suggested. One blast caught Lucky in the shoulder, his armor absorbing most of the impact, but still sending him staggering. They've adjusted their weapon frequencies, Marcus shouted, deflecting a blast with his spear's shaft. The armor's not neutralizing as much as it should. Nick gritted his teeth, advancing steadily despite the barrage. Keep moving, don't give them time to. His warning cut off as he saw something that made his blood run cold. A group of fresh soldiers were deploying what looked like portable energy projectors, creating overlapping fields of deadly force. New threat, Mary Bell called out, her tactical display highlighting the danger. They're trying to box us in. Captain Wallace's voice crackled over the comm. All units, be advised. The Fress are using new containment tactics. They're trying to trap our melee units in kill zones. Do not let them complete the energy field network. Nick's mind raced. The Fress were adapting faster than expected, but so could they. Spear Squad, remember the Macedonian drills. Diamond formation. His team responded instantly, forming up around him in a tight diamond pattern. Their spears extended outward at different angles, power fields creating a mobile fortress of lethal reach. It was an ancient phalanx tactic adapted for modern warfare. The formation proved its worth almost immediately. A fresh soldier, more aggressive than its companions, charged their position with some kind of energy blade. The alien never got close enough to use it. Mary Bell's spear took it through its midsection from 10 feet away. They've got their own melee weapons, Marcus reported, but they don't know how to use them properly. No discipline. Nick saw he was right. The Fress had clearly rushed to develop countermeasures against human melee weapons, but they lacked the centuries of martial tradition that humans drew upon. Their movements were uncoordinated, their tactics rushed and inefficient. But what the Fress lacked in technique, they made up for in numbers and technology. More of them were pouring out of the fortress, carrying an array of weapons that seemed designed specifically to counter melee marines. Energy nets, containment fields, some kind of sonic projectors that made Nick's teeth rattle, even through his helmet. Push forward, Wallace ordered. Don't let them establish a defensive line. The battle devolved into a series of intense close-quarters engagements. Nick's squad used their superior reach to keep the Fress at bay, while the sword teams moved in to handle any that got past them. The combination proved devastatingly effective, but the cost was mounting. A massive energy blast caught Private Smith directly in the chest. His armor held, but the impact sent him sprawling. Before Nick could reach him, a Fress soldier was there, energy blade raised high. Time seemed to slow. Nick saw Smith trying to bring his spear around, saw the Fress warrior's blade starting its downward arc. They were too far away, a sword would never reach them in time. But Nick didn't have a sword. His spear shot forward like a bolt of lightning, its power field leaving a blue trail in the twilight air. The blade caught the Fress soldier just below what passed for its shoulder, the power field disrupting its shell, while the physical blade drove deep. The alien fell, its energy weapon sputtering out. Thanks, boss, Smith gasped as Nick helped him up. Thought I was done for. Save it for the debrief, Nick replied, but he couldn't help feeling a surge of pride. The squad was proving its worth, validating all those months of training. Then Mary Bell's voice cut through the chaos. Lieutenant, you need to see this. She was kneeling by the fallen Fress soldier, her helmet's sensors scanning something. Their communications. I'm picking up fragments. Something about Project Echo. And there's a word that keeps repeating. Adaptation. Before Nick could respond, Wallace's voice thundered over the comm. All units, fall back and regroup. They're bringing up something big. Through the swirling snow, Nick saw what had triggered the captain's warning. A massive vehicle was emerging from the fortress, bristling with weapons. But it was the design that caught his attention. It looked almost like a giant mechanical version of ancient Earth siege weapons. They're learning from us, Lucky said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and concern. They're adapting our old weapons too. Nick watched the machine advance, his mind already working on tactics to counter it. The Fress were indeed learning faster than anyone had expected. But as he looked at his squad, their spears still glowing with power, despite the brutal fight, he knew humanity still had plenty of surprises left. Spear Squad, ready for Phase 2, he ordered, settling into a fighting stance. Let's show them why humanity invented the spear before the sword. Now, on a battlefield far from Earth, they were learning that humanity's martial heritage was far deeper and more dangerous than they had imagined. And this lesson was only beginning. The descent into the Novus 11 tunnel network felt like entering the throat of some ancient beast. Nick's squad moved in tight formation, their spears' power fields providing both illumination and protection in the cramped space. The walls were smooth, almost polished, bearing the distinctive marks of Fress mining technology. Hard to believe they carved all this out in just a few months, Mary Bell whispered over the squad's private channel. After the battle on the surface, Command had detected massive energy readings emanating from deep underground. Now, Nick's Spear Squad was leading the reconnaissance mission to find their source. Fress are natural tunnelers, Lucky replied, his usual jovial tone subdued in the oppressive darkness. Something about evolving from burrowing creatures. Nick held up his fist, bringing the squad to an immediate halt. His helmet's sensors had picked up something ahead, a faint vibration running through the rock itself. Everyone feel that? Yeah, Marcus confirmed, checking his readings. Getting some weird energy signatures too, different from their usual tech. Captain Wallace's voice crackled over the comm, distorted by the layers of rock between them and the surface. Stay alert, Spear Squad. Surface teams are reporting increased Fress activity near your position. Whatever's down there, they don't want us finding it. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that made Nick's breath catch in his throat. Massive manufacturing facilities stretched into the darkness, their architecture alien yet purposeful. Assembly lines moved with precise efficiency, producing something. Get me a better look at those production lines, Nick ordered, keeping his squad in the shadows near the chamber's entrance. Mary Bell adjusted her helmet's sensors, zooming in on the nearest assembly unit. Sir, those look like weapon components, but not their usual energy weapons. These are different. Nick saw she was right. The Fress were manufacturing what appeared to be melee weapons, not just the crude energy blades they'd encountered on the surface, but sophisticated hybrid weapons that combined their energy technology with physical striking surfaces. They're copying us, Marcus said, his voice tight, but they're doing it their way. Before Nick could respond, movement caught his eye. A group of Fress workers was approaching their position, engaged in what appeared to be an animated discussion. Nick signaled his squad to remain still, their armor's adaptive camouflage blending with the shadows. Project Echo must be accelerated, one Fress was saying, its shell vibrating with agitation. The humans' martial technologies are proving more effective than anticipated. The Imperium demands results. The integration is proceeding as fast as possible, another responded. But merging their primitive combat techniques with our superior technology requires careful calibration. The last test subjects. The conversation faded as they passed, but Nick had heard enough. Command, are you getting this? Affirmative, Wallace replied. Sounds like they're trying to reverse engineer our melee combat capabilities. Keep pushing deeper. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. The squad advanced through the facility, documenting everything they saw. The further they went, the more disturbing the discoveries became. They found testing chambers where Fress soldiers practiced with their new weapons against holographic humans. Labs filled with captured human melee weapons in various stages of dissection. And something else, something that made Nick's blood run cold. Sir Lucky called out, his voice shaking slightly. You need to see this. In a sealed chamber, visible through a transparent barrier, stood a series of combat suits. They looked like twisted parodies of human melee marine armor, adapted for Fress physiology. But it was what was next to them that really caught Nick's attention, tactical displays showing detailed analyses of human combat techniques, including. Those are classified training videos, Mary Bell breathed. From our facility, from the vault. They've got a spy, Marcus growled. Someone's been feeding them information. Nick was about to respond when his helmet's proximity sensors screamed a warning. Multiple contacts. We've got company. The chamber's main doors slid open, revealing a squad of Fress soldiers. But these weren't the typical troops they'd fought on the surface. These warriors wore prototype versions of the armor they'd just discovered, and they carried weapons that hummed with a familiar energy signature. Humans, the lead Fress announced, its voice translated by their suit systems. Your primitive weapons impressed us, briefly. Now witness true Fress superiority, your crude techniques refined and perfected by superior minds. Nick settled into a fighting stance, his spear's power field intensifying. Around him, his squad did the same, forming their practice diamond formation. Superior minds, he replied, don't always win fights. Sometimes, experience counts for more. The Fress charged as one, their movements showing evidence of studied human techniques, but lacking the fluid grace that came from generations of martial tradition. Their weapons a mix of energy glaives and short power blades sparked against the air itself. Hold formation, Nick ordered. Remember your training. They may have our tech, but they don't have our history. The fight that followed was unlike anything Nick had experienced. The Fress warriors were strong and their weapons deadly, but their movements were mechanical, learned from observation rather than experience. In contrast, Nick's squad fought with the accumulated wisdom of countless human battles, their spears moving in patterns refined over millennia. A Fress warrior broke through their line, its energy glaive slashing toward Marcus. But the long reach of the spears proved decisive once again. Nick's blade took the alien in the side while Mary Bell's thrust caught it from another angle. The prototype armor sparked and failed under the coordinated attack. Fall back, Nick ordered as more Fress troops poured into the chamber. We've got what we came for. Tactical retreat. As they fought their way back through the tunnels, Nick's mind raced. The Fress weren't just adapting to human melee combat, they were trying to perfect it, to turn humanity's own martial heritage against them. And somewhere, someone was helping them do it. But watching his squad work together, their spears moving in ancient patterns upgraded with modern technology, Nick felt a surge of confidence. The Fress could study human combat techniques all they wanted, but some things couldn't be learned from observation alone. Now, deep under the frozen surface of Novus 11, both sides were about to discover that the true strength of human martial traditions lay not in the weapons themselves, but in the souls of those who wielded them. The debriefing room was silent as the holographic replay ended, showing the last moments of their encounter with the Fress prototype warriors. Nick stood at attention, his squad arrayed behind him, as Captain Wallace and 3 intelligence officers studied the footage. Well, Wallace said finally, looks like the Fress are quick studies, but not quick enough. He turned to the intelligence team. Thoughts? The lead analyst, a sharp-eyed woman with colonel's insignia, leaned forward. The leak is concerning. Very concerning. But Lieutenant Vance's footage confirms something we've suspected. The Fress can't quite replicate the human element. Their movements are technically correct but lack something. Soul, Lucky muttered from behind Nick. They lack soul. The colonel's eyes snapped to Lucky. An imprecise term, Sergeant O'Connor, but not entirely incorrect. The Fress are trying to reduce human martial arts to pure mathematics. They don't understand that there's more to it than that. Nick thought about Michael then, about all the times they'd sparred growing up. About how his brother had always said that fighting wasn't about the moves, it was about the heart behind them. Dismissed, Wallace announced suddenly. Except you, Lieutenant. We need to discuss your next assignment. As his squad filed out, Nick caught the worried glances they exchanged. After what they'd discovered underground, everyone knew things were about to change. Hours later, Nick found his team in the base's recreation area. They'd pushed several tables together and were huddled over what looked like old-style paper maps of the Novus 11 tunnel systems. Boss Marcus called out as Nick approached. Please tell me we're not getting split up. Nick dropped into an empty chair, feeling the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. No, we're staying together. But our mission parameters have changed. He looked each of them in the eye. We're going hunting. Mary Bell leaned forward. Hunting what? Our spy. Nick pulled out his tablet, displaying the tactical data they'd recovered. Command thinks the leak has to be someone with direct access to the Vault's training programs. We're being tasked with setting a trap. Using ourselves as bait, Lucky asked, a grim smile on his face. Classic. Not exactly. Nick brought up a new set of images, modified spear designs. We're going to feed the spy some very interesting data about supposed upgrades to our weapons. Then we're going back underground to wait for the Fress to try replicating them. Marcus whistled low. Risky. If they figure out we're playing them. That's why we need to be perfect, Nick cut in. Which means we train harder than ever. Starting now. The next 2 weeks were brutal. They drilled constantly, developing new techniques that looked impressive but had subtle weaknesses only they would know how to exploit. They modified their spears with brilliant-looking but ultimately useless attachments, making sure the spy would have plenty of juicy technical data to steal. But more importantly, they grew closer as a unit. During brief rest periods, they shared stories, fears, hopes. Nick learned that Mary Bell had lost her sister at the same battle where his brother died. Marcus showed them all hollows of his daughter back on Earth. Lucky, it turned out, wasn't just a nickname. He'd survived 3 different Fress attacks because he'd been the one to pull others to safety, never leaving anyone behind. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Lucky found Nick alone in the maintenance bay, staring at his spear. "Thinking about your brother?" he asked quietly. Nick nodded. Michael would have loved this. Not the war, but this. The way we're fighting it. He always said humanity's greatest strength was its ability to look backward and forward at the same time. Smart guy Lucky settled onto a nearby crate. I was there when. Well, he saved 4 people that day. Pulled them back when the barrier started failing. If he hadn't. Nick turned sharply. "You never told me that." "I wasn't sure if I should, but watching you lead us these past months, you've got the same thing he had. That thing the Fress can't copy, no matter how hard they try." "And what's that?" Lucky stood, clapping Nick on the shoulder. "The understanding that a warrior isn't just someone who knows how to fight. It's someone who knows what they're fighting for." The next morning, as Nick watched his squad run through their deception routines, he realized Lucky was right. The Fress could study their techniques, copy their weapons, even try to replicate their tactics. But they couldn't copy the bonds that made a human squad more than the sum of its parts. Mary Bell's spear moved in perfect sync with Marcus's, covering each other's deliberate weak spots. Lucky called out positions using their private jokes as code words. They weren't just a unit anymore, they were family. "Looking sharp," Wallace commented, appearing beside Nick. "Think they're ready." Nick watched as his squad flowed through another complex routine, their spears tracing patterns in the air that looked beautiful but contained carefully planned flaws. To anyone studying the footage, it would look like they'd made revolutionary breakthroughs in melee combat techniques. "They're ready," Nick confirmed. "And so is our trap." Now, as Nick watched his squad prepare to turn the enemy's espionage against them, he understood something his brother had tried to tell him long ago. The greatest weapons in humanity's arsenal weren't the ones you could hold in your hands, but the ones you held in your heart. The storm came without warning. One moment, Novus 11's eternal twilight was as dim and foreboding as ever. The next, hurricane-force winds were hurling ice crystals sharp enough to scratch even their advanced armor. "Perfect timing," Lucky muttered over the squad channel. "They really know how to plan an attack." Nick didn't respond, his attention focused on his helmet's tactical display. The Fress were coming, just as planned, but something was wrong. That's a lot more forces than intel suggested. "Multiple contacts," Mary Bell reported, her voice tense. "They're not just testing our fake upgrades. This is a full assault." The approaching Fress army was massive, their formations illuminated by the storm's constant lightning. Leading the charge were dozens of their new melee units, wielding weapons clearly based on the falsified designs Nick's team had leaked. But behind them... "Command, are you seeing this?" Nick's voice was steady despite the cold dread settling in his stomach. "They've got some kind of... I don't even know what those are." Through the driving snow, he could make out enormous shapes, walking war machines that looked like monstrous combinations of Fress technology and ancient human siege weapons. Each one bristled with both energy weapons and massive physical blades. Captain Wallace's voice crackled through the storm static. "All units, fall back to secondary positions. This isn't just a probe, they're throwing everything they have at us." The retreat was orderly but quick. Nick's squad moved in perfect sync, covering each other as they withdrew to their prepared positions. Around them, other melee marine units did the same. The sword teams took up defensive formations while the few experimental axe and hammer units moved to protect their flanks. "They took our bait," Marcus said as they reached their new position. "But I don't think this is going exactly to plan." Nick was about to respond when the first wave of Fress forces hit their lines. The enemy melee troops moved exactly as expected, using the flawed techniques they'd been fed. Their weapons copies of the upgraded spears Nick's team had demonstrated behaved exactly as planned, their power fields fluctuating in ways that made them vulnerable to specific countering moves. But there were so many of them. "Form up," Nick ordered as a group of Fress warriors charged their position. Diamond pattern, just like we practiced. His squad's response was immediate and perfect. Their spears moved in the true patterns they'd kept secret, not the flashy but flawed ones they'd leaked. The first wave of Fress troops fell quickly, their copied weapons and techniques proving worthless against the real thing. Then the war machines reached their lines. The ground shook as the massive constructs advanced through the storm. They were even more terrifying up close, 3-story tall nightmares that seemed to have crawled out of some twisted merger of medieval manuscripts and alien technology. Their primary weapons were enormous blade-like appendages charged with energy fields that made Nick's spear look like a toy in comparison. "Focus fire on the joints," Wallace ordered over the general channel. "Those things are too heavily armored for direct attacks." Nick's squad moved as one, their spears striking at the weak points they could reach. Other units did the same, sword teams darting in to slash at exposed mechanisms while ranged units poured fire into the gaps. But for every war machine they managed to disable, 2 more seemed to appear out of the storm. And now the Fress were deploying some new kind of troops, smaller, faster units that moved with a precision their previous melee forces had lacked. Sir Mary Bell's warning came just in time. "These ones are different. They're not using our leaked techniques." She was right. These new Fress warriors moved with genuine skill, their weapons and tactics showing none of the flaws Nick's team had planted. They fought like real melee combatants. "Command," Nick called out as his spear barely deflected a strike that would have taken his head off. "I think we found our spy's handiwork. These units have been trained properly." "Confirmed," Wallace replied grimly. "All units be advised, we are now facing genuinely trained Fress melee troops. They're not just copying our moves anymore, they understand them." The battle devolved into chaos. The storm grew worse, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Nick's squad stayed together through it all, their years of training and months of fighting as one unit keeping them alive as the enemy pressed in from all sides. A massive explosion lit up the storm-dark sky. One of the Fress war machines had breached the main defensive line. Through gaps in the swirling snow, Nick could see other human units falling back in disarray. "We can't hold them," someone shouted over the general channel. "There's too many." But then Nick saw something, a pattern in the Fress attacks. The war machines, the overwhelming numbers, even the storm itself. "They're hurting us," he realized suddenly. "Command, this isn't just an attack, it's a trap. They're driving us towards something." Wallace's response was lost in a burst of static as another explosion rocked the battlefield. But Nick could see it clearly now. The Fress weren't just testing their stolen techniques or trying to overwhelm the human forces. They were pushing them toward a specific area of the battlefield. "Squad, on me," Nick ordered, his mind racing. "We need to break through their lines. Whatever they're pushing us toward, we have to see it before." His words cut off as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. And this time, it wasn't from the war machines. Nick felt the earth itself shaking beneath him. He realized with growing horror that the enemy had learned more from humanity's martial history than anyone had expected. Because sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one you can see coming. It's the one waiting below your feet. The ground split open like a wound, swallowing entire squads of human forces. Through the growing fissures, something massive began to emerge. "By all that's holy luck," he whispered, his usual humor completely gone. "They built it underground. The whole time we were hunting for their superweapon in their facilities. They were building it right under our feet," Nick finished, watching in horror as the machine rose from the depths of Nova's 11. It was like something out of humanity's darkest medieval nightmares, scaled up to impossible proportions and given terrifying life by Fress technology. A fortress that walked, its walls bristling with both energy weapons and physical armaments. But it was the center that drew Nick's attention, a massive spear-like projection that crackled with enough energy to make his helmet's sensors scream in warning. "Command," Nick shouted into his comm. "Are you seeing this?" Static answered him. The machine was putting out enough interference to disrupt their communications. They were cut off. Sir Marcus's voice was steady, but Nick could hear the tension in it. "What are our orders?" Nick watched as more human units were forced back by the Fress assault, being herded ever closer to the rising monstrosity. His tactical display was going crazy, trying to analyze the energy readings from the central spear. Whatever it was building to some kind of crescendo. That's when he saw a familiar sigil on one of the weapon's auxiliary control panels. The same mark he'd seen in the underground facility, next to the stolen training data. "Mary Bell," he called out. "Remember those power fluctuations we documented in their prototype weapons? The ones based on our leaked designs?" She nodded, deflecting a blast from an approaching war machine. "The fatal flaw we built in? What about it?" "Look at their fortress. Same power signature, scaled up. They didn't just steal our weapon designs, they based their whole superweapon on them." Understanding dawned in his squad's body language. The Fress had taken their bait so completely that they'd incorporated the flawed design principles into everything they'd built. "If we can reach those control panels," Nick continued, "we might be able to trigger a cascade failure. But we'd have to fight through their entire army to reach it." Lucky finished. "Suicide mission." No, Marcus cut in. "Not their entire army. Look, they're so focused on hurting our main forces, their flank is exposed. Right there, between those two war machines." Nick saw it too. A gap in their lines, probably left intentionally to help funnel human forces where the Fress wanted them. But for a small, fast-moving unit. "Captain Wallace," Nick tried one more time on the command channel. Nothing but static. "Squad, this is officially an unauthorized action. Anyone who wants to sit this one out." "Oh, shut up," Sir Lucky interrupted. "Your brother saved my life once. About time I returned the favor to the family." "We're with you," Mary Bell added, her spear's power field brightening with renewed energy. "All the way." Nick felt something tighten in his chest. This was what the Fress couldn't copy, couldn't understand. This bond that went beyond training and tactics. "Diamond formation," he ordered, settling into position. "Power fields at maximum. We move fast, we hit hard, and we don't stop for anything." They moved like one organism, 4 spears creating a lethal zone of control around them. The first Fress units to spot them barely had time to raise an alarm before being cut down. But the alarm was raised nonetheless. "Incoming," Marcus called out as 2 of the war machines turned to face them. "They're adapting their formation." "Keep moving," Nick led them through a series of lightning-fast position changes they'd developed in training but never shown where the spy could see. They don't know these patterns. Their charge became a deadly dance through the Fress lines. Where sword teams would have been bogged down in close combat, the spear's reach let them strike and move without losing momentum. Where other units would have been forced to stop and fight, their formation let them push through. But the enemy's numbers were telling. Lucky took a hit that cracked his armor's outer layer. Mary Bell was limping from a near miss by one of the war machines. Even Marcus's steady movements were showing signs of strain. They were halfway to their goal when Nick's tactical display lit up with new warnings. The central spear was beginning to move, aligning itself with the largest concentration of human forces. "It's some kind of focusing array," Mary Bell shouted over their local comm. "They're going to fire." Nick made a split-second decision. "Lucky," Marcus, break right. "Draw their attention. Mary Bell, you're with me. We're going for the control panel." His squad split smoothly, years of training letting them adjust instantly to the new formation. Lucky and Marcus peeled off, their spears flashing as they engaged the nearest war machine. Mary Bell fell in beside Nick as they sprinted for their target. The panel was just ahead now. Nick could see the access points, the power routing exactly where their leaked designs said they would be. All they had to do was reach it. That's when the central spear began to glow. The Fress had been winning the war against humanity. Then humans brought swords. But as Nick raced against time toward the heart of the enemy's greatest weapon, he realized that the true test wasn't going to be won with swords or spears or any weapon at all. It would be won with sacrifice, courage, and the kind of brotherhood that no amount of stolen data could replicate. The massive spear-like projection was mere seconds from firing when Nick and Mary Bell reached the control panel. Up close, the Fress superweapon was even more terrifying, a twisted marriage of medieval architecture and alien technology that loomed against Novus 11's storm-dark sky. "Cover me," Nick ordered, jamming his spear into a maintenance hatch and using it as a lever. The panel groaned open, revealing a maze of energy conduits and control systems. Mary Bell took up a defensive position, her spear moving in precise arcs as Fress troops converged on their position. "Whatever you're going to do, sir, do it fast. Lucky and Marcus won't be able to keep those war machines occupied forever." Nick's hands flew over the alien controls, following the patterns they'd hidden in their leaked technical data. If he was right, if the Fress had copied their designs as completely as he thought. Interesting, a voice called out in mechanically translated English. "So this is what human warriors look like up close." Nick turned to find a Fress commander standing nearby, flanked by 4 of their new elite melee troops. The alien's shell bore elaborate markings he hadn't seen before, clearly a high-ranking officer. Commander Fress Zenith Mary Bell muttered over their private channel. "Intel says he's been leading their weapons development program here on Novus 11. The Fress commander's outer shell rippled with what Nick had learned to recognize as pride. "Your tactics have proven surprisingly effective elsewhere. The defeat of our forces in the Epsilon sector was most instructive. But here," the alien gestured at the superweapon around them, "here we have surpassed you. Your own martial heritage, perfected by superior minds." Sir Mary Bell's warning came just as the elite guards attacked. They moved with frightening skill, their weapons showing none of the flaws of earlier Fress attempts at melee combat. Nick threw himself back into the fight, his spear meeting their attacks with practiced precision. But these weren't the clumsy imitators they'd fought before. These warriors had been trained by someone who truly understood human combat techniques. "You're wondering about your spy," Fress Zenith called out as the battle raged. "Would you like to know who betrayed you, who taught us the true secrets of your combat arts?" "Nick," the weapon Mary Bell shouted, barely deflecting a strike that would have taken her head off. "It's about to fire." He could feel the energy building behind him, could see the targeting arrays aligning with the main human force in the distance. If that weapon fired, thousands would die instantly. But the commander's words had sparked something in his mind. "You know what your spy didn't teach you," Nick called back, his spear dancing through forms that were definitely not in any training manual. "They didn't teach you about adaptation." His weapon's power field suddenly shifted, changing frequency in a way that shouldn't have been possible according to the technical specifications they'd leaked. The Fress Guard's weapons, built to counter the fake techniques, couldn't adjust in time. Nick's spear took the first guard in the midsection, the modified power field shredding through their copied armor. Mary Bell, catching on immediately, made the same adjustment. 2 more guards fell before they could respond. Impossible. Fress Zenith's shell paled. Those movements, those frequencies, they weren't in any of the data. "Because we never wrote them down," Nick growled, advancing through the storm. "Some things can only be learned through experience, through brotherhood, through loss." His next strike disabled the 4th guard's weapon completely. Through watching good soldiers die and swearing to do better. The commander backed away, reaching for some kind of control device. "It doesn't matter. The weapon is charged. Your primitive tricks cannot stop." The alien's words cut off as Mary Bell's spear took it through what passed for a shoulder, pinning it to a bulkhead. Nick was already moving, his hands returning to the control panel with renewed purpose. "The spy taught you our forms," he said as he worked, "but they couldn't teach you our heart. Couldn't teach you why we fight the way we do." His fingers found the crucial sequence. "Couldn't teach you about the bonds between warriors that make us stronger than any technique." The superweapon's energy buildup reached critical levels. Warning klaxons blared across the entire structure. Fress Zenith's shell rippled in what might have been fear. "What have you done?" Nick stepped back, retrieving his spear. "We learned from every loss, every sacrifice. Did you learn from your victories? The energy that had been building in the massive spear-like projection began to pulse erratically. The flaws they'd hidden in their leaked designs were doing exactly what they'd planned, turning the weapon's power back on itself. Mary Bell, call the others. We need to move now. She was already on it, signaling Lucky and Marcus on their squad channel. As they rushed to escape the doomed superweapon, Nick paused just long enough to look the Fress commander in the eye. You wanted to understand humanity's martial heritage? Here's the most important lesson: the greatest warriors don't fight for glory or superiority. They fight for each other. The structure was beginning to shake itself apart as they ran. Behind them, Fress Zenith shouted something, but it was lost in the growing chaos. As Nick led his squad through the storm, running from the impending destruction of the enemy's greatest weapon, he finally understood what all those who had fallen before had died protecting: not just Earth, not just humanity, but the spirit that made them who they were. A spirit that no spy could steal, and no enemy could copy. For the first time since Nick had arrived on Novus 11, the eternal twilight gave way to something new. As the Fress superweapon collapsed in on itself, its destruction sent shockwaves through the storm system that had perpetually shrouded the battlefield. The clouds parted, allowing the binary star's light to pierce through, casting long shadows across the ice-covered terrain. Almost poetic, Lucky commented as they watched from a safe distance. Think the weather will stay clear. Nothing stays the same after a battle like this, Nick replied, his spear planted in the frozen ground beside him. Around them, other human units were regrouping, taking stock of their victories and losses. The destruction of the superweapon had turned the tide decisively. Without their ultimate trump card, and with their stolen techniques proven worthless against true human adaptation, the Fress forces had begun a full retreat. Early reports suggested that similar scenarios were playing out across other fronts. The enemy's rushed adoption of human melee combat had left them vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Captain Wallace found them as medical teams were treating the squad's injuries. The captain's armor was scorched and dented, but his voice was strong as ever. "Hell of a thing you pulled off," he said, looking at each member of the spear squad in turn. Unauthorized, reckless, and absolutely brilliant, a rare smile crossed his face. Command's already calling it the turning point of Novus 11. Did they identify the spy? Mary Bell asked, as a medic worked on her leg. Wallace's expression darkened. Yes, former combat instructor, turned out to be more interested in credits than loyalty. They caught him trying to transmit more data from the vault. He shook his head. But that's not what I came to tell you about. He pulled up a holographic display showing tactical data from across the sector. The Fress are finished, not just on this front but everywhere. Nick thought about that as he watched more human units arriving, securing the area around the destroyed superweapon. Among them, he noticed several teams wielding weapons he hadn't seen before: halberds crackling with energy fields, war hammers that hummed with barely contained power. "We're evolving too," he said quietly, "taking the old ways and making them new again." Which is why Wallace continued, "I've been authorized to offer you a new position. All of you," he gestured to the whole squad. "They're expanding the melee combat program. Not just swords and spears now, we're bringing back every weapon humanity ever created, upgrading them all with what we've learned. And we need instructors who understand both the techniques and the spirit behind them." Lucky laughed. "They want us to teach? You us?" "Who better?" Wallace countered. "You've proven that the old ways still have value, that humanity's martial heritage isn't just about the weapons we carry. And now." He gestured to where a group of Fress prisoners were being escorted, their movements suggesting not defeat but curious interest in their captors' weapons and methods. "Now we might have some very unusual students." 3 months later, Nick stood in a newly constructed training facility on Earth, watching as his students, human and alien alike, worked through basic spear forms. The sight of the aliens learning alongside humans still felt surreal sometimes, but the peace was holding. Both sides had learned valuable lessons about respect and adaptation. "Good form," he called out to a particularly dedicated alien Twiv trainee who had just executed a perfect thrust. "Remember, feel the weight of history in each movement. These techniques were developed over thousands of years." Mary Bell, now his chief assistant instructor, approached with a datapad. Latest reports from the integration program. The Texan Knights are actually teaching some Scarvan units mounted combat. Apparently they're surprisingly good at it, once they got used to the height. Nick smiled, remembering those whispered conversations about the Texas facility that now seemed so long ago. Humanity hadn't just adapted its ancient weapons, it had adapted its entire approach to warfare and peace. A familiar presence appeared beside him. "They're learning well," Captain Wallace observed. "Both sides." Nick nodded, watching as human and alien students paired off for sparring exercises. They are. But more importantly, they're learning the right lessons. This time he touched the dog tags he still wore under his instructor's uniform. Michael would have loved to see this. "Your brother helped make it possible," Wallace said quietly. "Everyone who fell in this war did. They showed us we needed to change, to look back to our past to find our future." As Nick watched a human student help another TWIV trainee correct their grip on a practice spear, he felt a deep sense of rightness. The war had transformed both species in ways no one could have predicted. The Fress had been winning the war against humanity. Then humans brought swords, spears, and a myriad of other weapons no other civilization would have thought to resurrect in their modern era. Thank you for listening to this latest installment of the Melee Marines story. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give it a like and a share. Also feel free to comment with your thoughts and subscribe if you would like to see more stories like this one. I will see you in the next one.